Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're exploring the power and nuance of words.
That's right. We use words every single day.
Yeah.
And it's really quite amazing how much power they actually have over our thoughts and emotions and even our reality. And
I think it's something that a lot of us take for granted.
oh, absolutely.
We don't really think about it.
We don't. And we kind of think that the word is just the word. Like, it's the dictionary definition and that's it.
Right. It's just a tool.
It's a tool, but there's so much more to it.
Right. There's a whole universe of meaning kind of hidden beneath that surface.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what are some of the less obvious ways that words can kind of hold sway over us?
Well, one of the key things is the whole concept of connotation.
Okay.
And connotation is the sort of emotional and cultural baggage that a word carries beyond its literal definition.
Right.
So, for example, if you take the word snake.
Yeah, just even the sound of that word evokes certain feelings.
Exactly.
It's not just about a legless reptile.
Right. No, it's not.
Right.
Right. And, what's even more intriguing is how, words change over time.
Right.
Did you know, for instance, that the word awful originally meant worthy of awe?
Oh, wow.
Or that nice used to mean foolish.
Wow. That is pretty drastic shift.
It is.
So it really shows you that language is fluid.
So absolutely.
It changes.
It changes all the time. Yeah, it's like a living, breathing organism that's constantly adapting and changing.
And this evolution is tied to cultural shifts too, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what might be, a neutral word in one culture could be taboo in another.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, you have to be really careful about
Right.
how you use words, particularly when you're communicating across cultures.
Right. Can you give us an example of how, these cultural differences can impact the meaning of words?
Oh, sure. Well, let me think about the word family.
Okay.
Many Western cultures, it centers around the immediate family, parents and children.
Nuclear family.
The nuclear family.
Okay.
Right. But then if you look at many Eastern cultures, family encompasses a much broader network
Right.
of relatives. And there's a strong emphasis on obligations and shared identity.
Right. So it's not just a different word. It's reflecting a whole different way of understanding those relationships and the structure of society.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And this sort of cultural lens extends to all sorts of concepts.
Wow.
Even colors carry different symbolic meanings across cultures.
Right.
Red, for example, might represent passion or danger in the West.
Right.
But in some Asian cultures, it symbolizes luck and prosperity.
I've definitely had those lost in translation moments
Yeah.
when traveling where something I thought was harmless had a very different meaning in another culture. So how do we navigate these complexities
Right.
and communicate effectively across these boundaries?
Well, I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
We need to be mindful that our own cultural assumptions might not be universal.
Right.
And then I think it's about being curious and open to learning about other perspectives.
So being a good listener
Absolutely.
and being willing to ask when we're not sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And being sensitive to the nuances of language and, avoiding assumptions.
Right.
What might seem like a straightforward statement in one culture could be interpreted in a completely different way in another culture.
Yeah. So much of communication really is about those unspoken rules and those subtle cues.
It is. It is.
So now I'm curious about this whole thing with categorizing words as good or bad.
Yeah.
Why do we even do that?
Right.
It's not like someone just decided this word is bad and that word is good.
Right. You're right. It's not arbitrary at all.
Right.
These classifications are deeply rooted in our social and emotional needs.
Okay.
So, bad words often violate social taboos.
Right.
And they kind of serve a purpose by, expressing things like aggression or disrespect.
So by pushing those boundaries, they help define what's acceptable in a society.
Exactly. They act as a form of social regulation, reinforcing boundaries and highlighting what's considered inappropriate.
It's like society's way of saying, hey, these are topics that we don't talk about lightly.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
and on the flip side,
Right.
good words generally promote social cohesion, expressions of gratitude, affection, respect.
Right.
These words build bonds and encourage cooperation.
Right.
They reinforce the values and behaviors that kind of hold the society together.
It's fascinating how these seemingly simple words play such a vital role in shaping, our social dynamics,
They do.
right?
They really do.
But I imagine there's also a personal element to these good and bad words.
Well, absolutely.
Right.
There's a profound emotional dimension as well.
Right. Certain words just trigger really strong emotional responses in us.
They do. They do.
Regardless of the social context.
Absolutely.
So how does that work?
Well, bad words can be a way to release intense negative emotions.
Right.
Think about moments of anger,
Right.
frustration,
Right.
pain. Sometimes a bad word can feel like the only way to express the intensity of what we're feeling.
Like a pressure valve.
It is. It is.
Right. But of course, we have to be mindful of how and when we use those words.
Absolutely.
Because they can have a big impact.
Of course, yeah.
On others.
And, on the other side of that, good words evoke those positive emotions. Joy, love, hope.
Right.
They provide comfort and validation.
Right.
And they can even be a source of inspiration.
So it's like we have this emotional vocabulary. And we use different words to kind of express these different emotional states.
Exactly. And, it's even more remarkable is that there's a physiological impact.
Really?
That words can have on us.
Wow.
Studies have shown that, bad words can actually trigger a stress response in the body.
Wow.
Your heart rate might increase.
Wow.
You might feel a surge of adrenaline.
So our body is reacting as if we're facing a real physical threat.
Yes.
That's incredible.
And on the flip side, good words can have the opposite effect. They can release endorphins and, other neurochemicals that are associated with pleasure and well-being.
So it's like a chemical reward system.
It is.
For using positive language.
It is.
That's amazing. Okay, so then it's not just about the emotional impact. There's an actual physical response.
Yes.
Measurable physical response.
Yes.
To the words that we use and that we hear.
Absolutely.
But why do bad words seem to have this extra powerful effect on us?
Well, one factor is their taboo nature.
Okay.
The fact that they're forbidden or frowned upon almost gives them a sense of allure.
Yeah.
It's a classic forbidden fruit effect.
Right. The more you're told you can't say something,
the
more powerful it seems.
The more powerful it seems. And they also tend to violate social norms and expectations.
Right.
Which makes them stand out and grab our attention.
You're right.
And they also often tap into primal emotions.
Okay.
Bypassing our rational thought processes
Yep.
and triggering a more visceral response.
They hit us on a deeper level.
They do. They do.
So then what about good words? How do they affect us on a deeper level?
Well, good words have this unique ability to offer validation and affirmation.
Okay.
They can reinforce a positive self-image
Okay.
and make us feel like we belong.
Right.
And they also provide that emotional support and comfort and reassurance.
Right. A kind word can be so powerful.
Absolutely.
Especially, if someone is struggling.
Absolutely. And let's not underestimate the power of good words to inspire and motivate.
Right.
Think about words like courage,
Right.
hope, love.
Right.
They could ignite a spark within us and push us to achieve incredible things.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how choosing our words carefully can have a huge ripple effect.
It can.
On so many areas of life.
Absolutely.
And this brings us to the point I think that the research makes, which is, why can't we just stick to neutral language?
Right.
Just strip away all the emotion, all the baggage, and just keep it factual?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that kind of solve these problems?
Well, that sounds great in theory.
Right.
But it turns out that language is inherently evaluative.
Right.
We can't just detach words from their connotations.
Right.
Even seemingly neutral words carry subtle implications based on context.
Right.
Tone of voice, who's saying them.
So even if I say the word interesting in a completely flat tone, it could still be interpreted as sarcastic or judgmental.
Precisely.
Depending on the situation.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this. Humans are fundamentally emotional beings.
Right. We can't just shut off our feelings, and those feelings influence how we interpret and use language.
Absolutely.
Okay, so then it's not about eliminating emotion from language.
Right.
It's about learning to use it effectively and consciously.
You got it.
Okay, so that brings us to this whole idea of conscious communication.
Yes.
So what are we talking about here?
Well, conscious communication starts with understanding that language isn't just about conveying information.
Okay.
It's about creating connections, building trust, and navigating the complex landscape of human emotions.
So it's really about being mindful of the impact that our words have on other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It requires us to step outside of our own heads and consider the other person's perspective.
Right. How might they interpret what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What emotions might my words evoke in them?
Okay, but that sounds like a lot to keep track of.
It is.
So where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good starting point is simply becoming more aware of our own communication patterns.
Go ahead.
What kind of language do we typically use? Are we direct or indirect? Formal, informal?
Right.
Are we good listeners? Or do we tend to dominate conversations?
So self-awareness is key.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then how do we go from awareness to actually changing the way we communicate?
Once we have a better understanding of our own tendencies, we can start to identify areas where we might want to make adjustments.
Okay.
So, for example, if we tend to be very critical in our communication, we might practice using more encouraging and supportive language.
Right. So it's about being intentional with the words that we choose.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other tips for being a more conscious communicator?
One of the most important skills is active listening.
Oh.
And, it's about truly hearing and understanding what the other person is saying.
Right. It's so easy to get caught up in our own thoughts, and we kind of miss what the other person is trying to communicate.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. So how can we be better listeners?
Well, active listening involves paying attention to both the verbal and nonverbal cues that the other person is sending. What's their tone of voice?
Right.
What are their facial expressions and body language telling you?
Right.
And it's about asking clarifying questions to make sure you're understanding their perspective.
So it's about being present.
Absolutely.
In the conversation.
Yeah.
And engaging on that deeper level.
Yes.
And then when we're expressing ourselves, I imagine it's important to be mindful of our tone and delivery.
It is. It is.
Because, a message delivered with harshness or sarcasm can be damaging.
Absolutely.
Even if the words themselves are well-intentioned.
Absolutely. Yeah, sometimes it's not what we say, but how we say it.
Right.
That really makes an impact.
Yeah. I've learned that one the hard way a few times.
I think we all have.
Yeah.
I think we all have. And another key aspect of conscious communication is learning to manage our emotions effectively.
Okay.
When we're feeling angry or frustrated or overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's easy to let those emotions kind of hijack our communication.
It's like they take over.
They do.
And we say things that we later regret.
Absolutely.
So how do we keep those emotions in check?
Well, it's about developing self-awareness and learning to recognize those emotional triggers.
Okay.
And when we feel those intense emotions rising, it's important to take a step back and pause before reacting.
Okay.
This could mean taking a few deep breaths, counting to 10.
Right.
Or even excusing yourself from the conversation until we've had a chance to calm down.
So creating space between that emotion and the reaction.
Exactly.
So we can respond in a more thoughtful way.
Exactly. And then when we're ready to engage in the conversation, it's important to focus on expressing our feelings in a constructive way.
Right.
Instead of blaming or attacking the other person.
Right.
We can focus on expressing our own needs and perspectives.
Right. So I feel frustrated when, as opposed to you, always.
Exactly. It's about owning our emotions and taking responsibility for how we communicate them.
Okay, this is giving me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It sounds like conscious communication is really a skill that takes practice and intention.
It does.
But what about those situations where we're dealing with someone who's not communicating consciously?
Right.
How do we navigate those interactions?
That's a great question, and it can be very challenging.
Yeah.
To communicate effectively when the other person isn't receptive or is using harmful language. And, in those situations, it's important to set boundaries and protect our own well-being.
Right. So that might mean, disengaging from the conversation or removing ourselves from the situation.
Sometimes that's the healthiest choice, We can't control how others communicate.
Right.
But we can control how we respond.
Right. And we don't have to tolerate harmful behavior.
We don't.
Even in the name of communication.
We don't.
Right.
And sometimes simply stating our boundaries clearly can be helpful.
Right.
We can say something like, I'm not comfortable with this conversation right now, or I'm not going to engage in this kind of language.
It's about standing up for ourselves and setting those limits.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if the situation allows, we can try to gently redirect the conversation toward a more constructive path.
Okay.
This might involve asking clarifying questions.
Okay.
Summarizing what we've heard.
Right.
Or simply acknowledging the other person's feelings.
So even when we're faced with these more challenging communication styles, there are ways to approach it with consciousness and intention.
Absolutely. And remember, conscious communication isn't about being perfect.
Right.
It's about being aware, being intentional, and continuously striving to improve our interactions with others.
Right. This has been so insightful. I feel like I'm starting to see communication in a whole new light.
Me too.
But I am curious about how this plays out in different areas of life. Like, how does this work in the workplace, for example?
Oh, the workplace is a great example of where conscious communication can make a huge difference.
Right.
I mean, think about all the interactions we have throughout the workday, meetings, emails, presentations, casual conversations.
Yeah, we spend so much of our lives at work.
We do.
And the way we communicate can have a huge impact on, our productivity and our relationships with our colleagues.
Absolutely.
And our overall job satisfaction.
Absolutely. And one of the most important aspects of conscious communication in the workplace is clarity.
Okay.
We need to be able to express our ideas clearly and concisely so that others can understand us.
Right, because no one wants to waste time.
Exactly.
Deciphering, confusing emails or trying to figure out what someone meant in a meeting.
Absolutely.
Right, so clarity is key. Any tips for communicating more clearly at work?
Well, one helpful tip is to focus on the what and the why.
Okay.
When you're communicating an idea, be sure to clearly state what you're proposing.
Okay.
Why it's important.
Right. So providing that context so people can understand the big picture.
Exactly. And it's also important to be mindful of your audience.
Okay.
And adjust your communication style accordingly.
Right.
If you're presenting to a group of senior executives, you might use a more formal tone and language than if you're chatting with colleagues over coffee.
So being adaptable.
Yes.
And tailoring your communication to the situation.
Exactly. And another key aspect of conscious communication in the workplace is active listening.
Right.
This is especially important when you're receiving feedback or trying to resolve a conflict.
It's so easy to get defensive when we're receiving criticism.
It is.
Even if it's well-intentioned.
It is, but when we practice active listening, we're able to hear the feedback without judgment.
Right.
And understand the other person's perspective.
Right. And that can help us to actually address the issue more effectively.
Absolutely.
Right.
And find a resolution that works for everyone.
So it's about creating a more open and collaborative work environment where people feel safe to share their ideas and thoughts.
Exactly. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of conscious communication in the workplace.
Okay.
Which is giving and receiving feedback effectively.
That's a big one. Feedback is essential for growth.
It is.
But it can be so tricky to navigate.
It is.
Right? Both for the giver and the receiver.
For both.
So how can we do that well?
Well, when it comes to giving feedback,
it's
important to be specific, constructive, and focused on the behavior, not the person.
Right. So instead of saying you're always late to meetings, you might say, I've noticed you've been late to the last few meetings.
Right. Exactly. That way you're addressing the issue directly without making it personal.
Without making it a personal attack.
Exactly. And when it comes to receiving feedback, it's important to listen openly, ask clarifying questions, and thank the person for their input.
Even if it's not the easiest feedback to hear.
Even if it's not. Because remember, feedback is a gift.
Okay.
Even when it comes wrapped in a less than perfect package.
I like that. Yeah, it's a good reminder to approach it with a growth mindset.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about clarity, active listening, and feedback. Any other tips for making conscious communication a habit in the workplace?
Well, one thing I found very helpful is to be mindful of nonverbal communication.
Oh, absolutely.
Our body language.
Yes.
Facial expressions.
Yeah.
Tone of voice.
Yes.
Can communicate just as much as our words.
Yeah.
Sometimes even more.
I've definitely been in those meetings where someone's saying all the right words, but their body language is screaming something totally different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's important to be aware of the messages we're sending non-verbally.
Right.
And make sure they're aligned with what we're saying.
Right.
For example, if you're trying to convey enthusiasm about a project.
Right.
But you're slumped over in your chair and avoiding eye contact.
Right.
Your message might not come across as authentic.
Right. It's about being congruent in our communication.
Yes.
Making sure our words, our tone, and our body language are all telling the same story.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, conscious communication in the workplace is about being clear, being respectful, being a good listener, and being mindful of those nonverbal cues.
I think that's a great summary.
Okay. Sounds like a recipe for a more positive and productive work environment.
I think so. And while we've been focusing on the workplace, these same principles can be applied to all areas of life.
Right.
Our relationships with family and friends, our interactions in our communities.
Absolutely.
Even our self-talk.
Right. Conscious communication is a skill that can benefit us.
It can.
In every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely.
But before we move on to those other areas, I'm curious to explore how conscious communication plays out in more challenging situations, like conflict resolution, for example.
Yeah, conflict is an inevitable part of life.
It is.
But how we approach it
Yeah.
can make a world of difference.
Right.
And conscious communication can be a powerful tool for navigating those choppy waters.
So let's talk about conflict. What are some key principles of conscious communication when it comes to resolving disagreements?
Well, first and foremost, it's about shifting our mindset
Okay.
from winning the argument
Right.
to finding a solution that works for everyone involved.
So collaboration rather than competition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this starts with acknowledging that everyone has their own valid perspective, even if we don't agree with it.
That can be tough.
It can.
Especially when we feel really strongly about something.
It can be.
Right. But I see how it's important to create that space for understanding.
It is.
What else can we do to communicate more consciously during conflict?
Active listening is crucial.
Oh, okay.
You know, it's about truly hearing the other person's concerns.
Right.
And trying to understand where they're coming from.
Right.
And this requires us to put aside our own judgments and assumptions.
So being curious rather than defensive.
Exactly.
Okay. Any tips for practicing active listening during a disagreement?
Well, one helpful technique is to reflect back what you've heard the other person say.
Okay.
This helps to ensure that you're understanding their perspective correctly.
Right. Right.
And it shows them that you're truly listening. You know,
Right.
you might say something like, so what I'm hearing you say is,
Right.
or it sounds like you're feeling.
It's about clarifying and validating their feelings.
Exactly.
Even if you don't agree with them.
Exactly. And it's also important to avoid interrupting.
Right.
Or talking over the other person.
Right.
Let them finish their thoughts before you respond.
Create that space to feel heard.
Yes.
And understood.
Exactly. And when it's your turn to speak,
Right.
focus on expressing your own needs and feelings clearly and respectfully.
Okay.
Avoid blaming or attacking the other person.
So using I statements instead of you statements.
Exactly. Right. For example, instead of saying, you're always so inconsiderate,
right,
you might say, I feel hurt when my needs are overlooked.
That's a much better way to approach it.
It is.
It's taking ownership of your own feelings.
Absolutely.
And expressing them in a way that invites dialogue.
Exactly.
Rather than defensiveness.
Exactly. And remember, conflict resolution is a process.
Right.
It often takes time and patience to find a solution that works for everyone involved.
Okay, this is so helpful. It's giving me a new framework for approaching those conflicts in a more mindful way.
Good. I'm glad.
But what about those situations where communication is completely broken down?
Right.
Is there any hope for repairing those relationships?
I believe there's always hope for healing and reconciliation, even in the most challenging situations.
Okay.
But it requires a willingness to be vulnerable.
Okay.
To take responsibility for our part in the breakdown.
Right.
And to truly listen to the other person's perspective.
So acknowledging the hurt
that's
been caused.
Yes.
And being willing to forgive.
Yes. Forgiveness is a powerful tool.
Okay.
For healing broken relationships. But it's important to remember that forgiveness is a process.
Right.
Not a single act.
Right. It's not always easy.
It's not. It takes time, and it's often messy.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I can see how it's essential for moving forward.
It is.
Right.
And sometimes seeking professional help from a therapist or counselor can be really beneficial in navigating those complex emotions and finding a path towards healing.
That's a good point. Sometimes we need that support to work through those conversations.
Absolutely. And even in situations where full reconciliation isn't possible.
Yay.
Conscious communication can help us to create a more peaceful and respectful parting of ways.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Even when relationships end, we can still choose to communicate with kindness and respect.
We can, because even in those difficult situations, our words matter.
This has been so insightful. I feel like I'm starting to see the power of conscious communication in a whole new light.
Me too.
But I'm curious to explore how these principles apply to other areas of life, like parenting, for example.
Parenting is a unique and challenging journey.
It is.
Where conscious communication is absolutely essential.
Right.
It's about building a strong and loving connection with our children.
Okay.
While also guiding them to become responsible and compassionate human beings.
That sounds like a tall order.
It is.
What are some of the key principles of conscious communication when it comes to parenting?
Well, one of the most important is active listening.
Okay.
Just like in any relationship, it's about truly hearing and understanding what our children are saying, both verbally and non-verbally.
Right. But kids don't always communicate in the most straightforward ways.
No, they don't.
How can we tune into what they're really trying to tell us, especially when they're really little?
Well, that's where paying attention to their nonverbal cues becomes especially important. Their facial expressions, body language, tone of voice can reveal a lot about how they're feeling, even if they don't have the words to express it.
So we're paying attention to the whole picture, not just the words.
Exactly.
What else can we do to be more conscious communicators as parents?
Well, it's important to create a safe and supportive environment where our children feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment or criticism.
So fostering that sense of trust and openness.
Exactly. And this means being willing to listen to their perspectives, even when we don't agree with them.
That can be tough, especially when they're pushing boundaries or testing our patience.
It can be. But it's so important.
But I see how it's important to let them know that their thoughts and feelings are valid.
Yes.
Even when their behavior might not be.
Exactly. It's about separating the child from the behavior. We can disapprove of a behavior without disapproving of the child.
Right. That's a helpful distinction.
It is.
Any other tips for communicating more consciously with our kids?
Well, it's important to be mindful of the language we use. Children are incredibly perceptive.
They are.
And they pick up on our tone and energy.
Yeah, even when we're trying to be patient, our frustration can leak out in our tone.
Absolutely.
Or body language.
Absolutely. So it's important to check in with ourselves. And make sure our words and our nonverbal cues are aligned. If we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, it's okay to take a moment to calm down. Before engaging with our children.
We can't pour from an empty cup.
Right. We need to take care of ourselves first.
Yeah. What about discipline? How can we approach that in a way that's both effective and conscious?
Well, discipline is about guiding our children towards making responsible choices. Not about punishing them for making mistakes. And this starts with setting clear boundaries and expectations.
So letting them know what's acceptable.
Exactly.
And what's not.
Exactly. And then when they do make mistakes, it's about responding with empathy and understanding.
So instead of, yelling or lecturing, we can try to see the situation from their perspective.
Exactly.
And help them learn from it.
It's about teaching them how to make better choices in the future.
This is giving me a lot to think about as a parent. It sounds like conscious communication is about creating a more respectful and collaborative relationship.
I think that's a great way to put it.
With your kids.
Yeah.
Rather than it always being, top down where the parents are always in charge.
Absolutely. It's about partnering with our children to help them grow and learn.
This has been so insightful. I'm starting to see the power of conscious communication in all these different areas of life.
It is. It's amazing, isn't it?
But there's one area we haven't touched on yet that I think is super relevant in today's world, and that's social media.
Social media. Oh, my gosh. It's such a powerful tool for connection and communication.
Yeah.
But it can also be a breeding ground for negativity and conflict.
Yeah, it's so easy to get sucked into that vortex of negativity.
It is. It is.
So how do we practice conscious communication in the digital world?
Well, it starts with being mindful of the content we consume and share. Are we engaging with posts that are uplifting and inspiring, or are we just getting,
Are we feeding the negativity?
Yeah, or are we just feeding that negativity?
Yeah.
And so, we have a choice in how we curate our online experience.
What else can we do?
Well, it's important to be aware of the impact our words can have on others.
No.
Just because we're interacting online doesn't mean that our words don't have real-world consequences.
It's easy to forget that there's an actual person on the other end of that screen.
Absolutely. And so it's important to choose our words carefully. And to avoid engaging in personal attacks or spreading misinformation.
Yeah, we have a responsibility to use our platforms for good.
Absolutely.
Any other tips for navigating social media in a more conscious way?
Well, one thing I found helpful is to take breaks from social media. When I'm feeling overwhelmed or triggered.
Yeah.
It's easy to get sucked into that endless scroll.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's important to just step away and reconnect with the real world.
Yeah, that's such good advice because it's so easy to get lost in that digital world.
It is.
And kind of lose sight of, what's important.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's also important to remember that social media is just one aspect of our lives. It's not the whole picture.
This has been so helpful. I feel like I'm seeing social media in a new light, but I'm curious to explore how conscious communication can help us to navigate even more challenging conversations.
Okay.
Like those surrounding, politics or social justice issues.
No, those are definitely conversations that can be fraught with emotion and complexity.
They are.
But they're also incredibly important conversations to have.
Yeah, we need to be able to engage in those dialogues constructively if we want to, create a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely, and conscious communication can help us do that.
Okay, so how can we apply the principles of conscious communication to these really sensitive topics?
Well, it starts with approaching those conversations with humility.
Okay.
And a willingness to learn.
Right.
It's about acknowledging that we all have blind spots.
Yeah.
And that we may not have all the answers.
So being open to different perspectives.
Exactly.
Even when we disagree.
Exactly. And it's about being mindful of the language we use.
Right.
Are we using language that's inclusive and respectful, or are we using language that's divisive and harmful?
Right. Because those words can either build bridges or create walls.
They can, and it's also important to remember that these are complex issues.
Right.
With no easy answers.
Right.
There's nuance and complexity to every side of these debates.
Yeah, it's not always black and white, right and wrong.
It's not. It's not.
Right. And it's important to be respectful of those nuances.
It is.
Even when we disagree.
Even when we disagree.
So even in these heated discussions, is it still possible to communicate with kindness and compassion?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's more important than ever to approach these conversations with empathy and understanding.
This has given me a lot to think about. It sounds like conscious communication can really be a powerful tool for building bridges and creating, a more just and equitable world.
I believe it can, and I think it all starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own communication.
Right.
And choosing our words with intention.
This has been such an incredible deep dive.
It has.
I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of the power of words and the importance of conscious communication.
Me too. It's been a real pleasure exploring this with you.
But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how conscious communication can help us to navigate our own inner world.
Oh, that's such an important point,
Because we've talked a lot about communication with others.
Right.
But what about communication with ourselves?
Right. The way we talk to ourselves can have a profound impact on our self-esteem.
Right.
Our motivation and our overall well-being.
It makes sense because there's constantly this inner dialogue happening.
Absolutely.
Like all the time.
In our heads. So how do we become more conscious of that self-talk and actually start to use it to our advantage?
Well, it starts with paying attention to the messages we're sending ourselves.
Okay.
What kind of language are we using? Are we being kind and supportive?
Right.
Or are we being critical and judgmental? So noticing those negative thought patterns and challenging them.
Exactly. And then it's about consciously choosing to replace those negative thoughts with more positive and affirming ones.
Right. So instead of saying, I'm such a failure, we might say, I'm learning and growing.
Exactly.
And I'm proud of myself for trying.
It's about speaking to ourselves with the same kindness and compassion that we would offer to a loved one.
That's such a beautiful way to think about it.
It is.
Right? Because we wouldn't tolerate someone else speaking to us harshly or disrespectfully. So why would we tolerate it from ourselves?
Exactly. We deserve our own kindness and compassion.
Right.
Absolutely.
This is really making me think about the power of our inner dialogue.
It is powerful.
It's like we have this amazing tool at our disposal to shape our own reality.
We do. And the more conscious we become of that inner voice, the more we can use it to support our growth and well-being.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I'm walking away with a whole new set of tools for communicating more consciously.
That's great.
Both with others and with myself.
Yeah.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
I have been.
And I can't wait to keep learning and growing in my own communication journey. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from, the subtle ways words shape our thoughts and emotions to practical tips for communicating more consciously in different areas of life.
It's been a fascinating journey through the power and nuance of language.
It really has. And before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge.
I love a good challenge.
Yeah.
What do you have in mind?
Well, throughout this deep dive, we've talked a lot about the impact our words have on others, but I think it's also important to reflect on the words that have the most power in our own lives.
That's such a powerful invitation to pause and consider the words that shape our inner world, our beliefs, our values, our aspirations.
Exactly. So my challenge to you, dear listener, is this. Take some time this week to reflect on the words that have the most power in your life.
What words come to mind when you think about your core values? What words inspire you? What words bring you comfort or ignite your passion?
And once you've identified those words, ask yourself how you can use them more consciously.
How can you weave them into your daily life? How can you use them to guide your actions and decisions?
Perhaps you can create a personal mantra using those powerful words, or maybe you can simply make a conscious effort to use them more often in your conversations and self-talk.
The key is to make those words a living, breathing part of your reality. Because when we align our words with our values and aspirations, we create a powerful force for positive change.
And remember, it's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of communication. It's about continuous growth and evolution.
Exactly.
So embrace the journey, be curious, be compassionate, and be open to the transformative power of words.
Because when we choose our words consciously, we choose to shape our reality in a more positive and meaningful way.
This deep dive has been an incredible reminder of that. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of language and its profound impact on our lives.
It's been a pleasure to dive deep with you.
And until next time, remember, choose your words wisely. They have the power to change your world.
This is DigitView.